Greetings, loyal listeners. You are now listening to an encore presentation of a B30 mini talk session. So please stand by as the previously recorded podcast will begin shortly. Thank you once again for choosing B30 for your listening pleasure.
The topic, it's about how Christians dealt with and responded to slavery. Okay, which was perfectly legal at that time. It was just part of regular life during the first century Mediterranean world. So a little background here. Growing up attending church, it comes with the territory that you gotta attend the Sunday schools and the Bible studies. And, over time, I started to pick up on this slavery thing that just keeps popping up time to time in New Testament letters, such as Ephesians, I think it was chapter 6, Galatians 5, I don't have the exact verses. Yeah, top-notch research and preparation for you right there. What else? 1 Timothy 6 and 1 Peter 2. And that one sticks out for me the most because I did a little time translating it for school and stuff. Anyways, they all refer to instructions on proper conduct between slaves and masters. But the reality is we never spend, or from my experience, we never spent time addressing that elephant in the room that there's Christians who own slaves. Now, for those who believe in justice, love, equality, and all that is good, the reality is that I guess Christians approved of slavery at that time, and they approved of it because they didn't officially oppose it. So my natural gut reaction is that's unacceptable. I mean, that's just not good enough. I mean, we have these holy standards laid out for us in this book, and for them, it was laid out for them by apostles and Jesus, and yet they're just rolling over and going with the flow of worldly values, so to speak. The main issue here is, didn't those slave-owning believers see like a moral conflict here? I mean, you have your Christian beliefs and you're acquiring slaves, like you're going down to the market, to the corner where you pick up a slave and where they auction them off and you're just putting your hand up and bidding on them. Like, where's your conscience? I thought as Christians, we're supposed to be these kind and compassionate people who love their neighbors, but it's fact that in the first century, Christians were acting like masters and gods themselves by owning other human beings. So how is that Christ-like in any shape or form? So textbook hypocrisy. You preach love and all that, but when you go home behind closed doors, you got slaves cleaning your chamber pot and like cleaning the crud off your slippers or something, or sandals. This is where I'm going to start my PR damage control pitch. So right now, evidence looks pretty bad for first century Christians. They own slaves. There's instructions in the Bible which tells them how to deal with them. However, I would just like to present a view that to truly understand the historically specific situation that our predecessors were in, we must first immerse ourselves in first century Greco-Roman rule and city life. Now, I say Greco-Roman world because during the first century, the Mediterranean region was basically the center of the world, or center of the universe. Because for all we know, I think North America was still First Nation, indigenous tribe inhabited, and my guess is Europe was still overrun by pagan, barbaric tribes. So the Mediterranean region, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and Northern Africa, that whole region was the center of the world. And Latin and Koine Greek was the lingua franca, or the form of universal communication, that universal language that people all used for business and social interaction with other different countries. The international official language, basically. The lingua franca, which is basically the English equivalent of our time. And the mainstream pop culture at that time was Greco-Roman Hellenistic culture or philosophy. Now, I find this history detour fairly necessary because I've always been telling myself sometimes, I have days where I would go, man, what a messed up or scary world we live in right now. Or, man, nowadays the world is more broken than ever. But then if you take the time and go over history, the truth is it's all relative. The world has always been cruel and unjust place. It's just a fact of life, regardless of what time period. So for instance, the time period when the biblical letters or the epistles were written, what I am about to describe is basically the typical Greco-Roman city experience in the first century New Testament era. Number one, there's no such thing as basic human rights. and there's no concept of individuality. For a person living in the 21st century, I take for granted every day that I get to wake up and ask myself, what do I want to do with myself today? Or what do I want to do in my life? Because people back then were culturally and socially conditioned to believe and act for the benefit of the state, the city, and the emperor. They had no mind of their own. They're basically like drones. You can do what you want as long as it doesn't interfere with the emperor, the city, and the state. It's just a very mediocre existence. Number 2, typical experience, living in the first century New Testament era. Living conditions for the city life was a nightmare. It's overcrowded, it's dirty, noisy public buildings, they're at risk at fire and like structural collapse. I mean, there's threat of plague and famine, and living with illness was considered normal. I mean, people would dump sewage out the front window. Kind of take for granted we can flush our poopies away on our precious porcelain thrones. And what else? Eating contaminated food and tapeworms were prevalent. So I guess people were really thin back then. And get this, life expectancy, 30 years old. So maybe that's why elders deserved a lot of respect back in the day. Because if you were able to live into old age and be old and stuff, you must have done something right to live past your life expectancy for your time period. I guess I see why elders should be respected, because they must know something to stay alive past 30. Okay, so let's recap here. They had no human rights, living conditions were a nightmare. Number 3, there was no concept of ethics. Right and wrong was basically, I can do whatever I want since I have the power to do so. Stop me if you can, kind of mindset. With that kind of dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest world, the average citizen would want to escape their reality. So indulging in quote-unquote distractions was just the norm. If you think about the Roman lifestyle, it's notorious for sexual orgies and drunkenness and gluttony and violent entertainment, like the Colosseum, where it would throw like slaves or Christians and then set loose like, I don't know, bulls and bears and lions, and they just maul the crap out of those poor souls. And that's their blood sport back then. Blood sport, orgies, getting drunk, and gluttony. Number 4, people lived in spiritual fear and despair. It's kind of hard for us to grasp because, say you believe in the Christian belief, the fundamental tenet of Christianity is that there's an absolute higher being who came down to earth and offers you eternal life. To a Greek philosopher or to a Greco-Roman citizen at that time, that was just unheard of, because the common understanding was that deities existed to harm humanity because, they kind of adapt. The Roman culture at that time kind of adapted the Greek mythology. So back then, all people did was dabble in pagan rituals and use magic potions and spells to try to manipulate and control those gods for their purposes. Because, life was a struggle. You had to survive. There's no time to ask for the meaning of life. I just gotta survive. People would do witchcraft and sorcery to try to manipulate gods to help them survive and make life easier for them. Again, this whole concept of Jesus, grace, and love and compassion was just, are you crazy? You're gonna get yourself killed if you care about others or if you're kind or look out for people. So they just couldn't wrap their heads around Christianity. Anyways, okay, now I'm going to get to the point of this history tour. How does this little history lesson connect with our original topic of slavery? The historical context, point number 5. War and conquest. Back then, every day the city gates would open and a steady influx of captives from other conquered nations or regions would come in. It's pretty obvious. Once those captives walk through the door into the city doors, they're automatically slaves. They have no rights. You're basically at the mercy of your captors. And what's really dark and frightening about that time was the primary function of slaves at that time were sexual playthings for the slave owner's amusement. Yes, so slaves were sexual playthings. That was their intended function and appeal when people bought them at auction at the marketplace. Or if you're a Roman citizen, you're living in a Greco-Roman influenced town or major urban city, because there's always increasing military victories, sexual slaves, or slaves in general, were like this renewable, replaceable, disposable resource. So with that being said, humanity basically had no value, because you kill one, you abuse one, you bury them in the yard, and the next day you go down to the marketplace, you buy yourself another one. humanity had no value. No one really cared. This is the situation that first century Christians were knee deep in. Slavery, perfectly legal. And as I'm about to read from 1 Peter 2, the Bible says you can comply with this law that slavery is legal and therefore you can practice it. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him. So there you have it. Textbook, black and white. Slavery is legal. The government okayed it, so submit to this human authority. Comply with the earthly law. My gut reaction is slavery is so wrong on so many levels. Why didn't they just do the whole Rage Against the Machine, start some anti-slavery movement, take a stand, preach to the people to give up on owning slaves? I mean, why not show some conviction, take a stand, I don't know, form a liberation front, anything to rebel against this injustice, right? But you look at it in a deeper sense, the reality is no one's going to listen, all right? They aren't going to give up on a sweet deal or a luxury item like free slave labor. If I can make a comparison, it's kind of like asking the people of today to boycott and ban poultry and cattle industry. It's kind of the same underlying appeal or problem. Like, no one's going to give up on a zillion-dollar industry that employs millions of people. And it's not going to happen when you're asking humanity to give up eating meat. Same as how it's hard to get people to give up having free human flesh sex toys. Same kind of basis. Now, I know it's cynical and jaded to think that, oh, you can't change the world and that is just the way the world works, but that's just how reality was. And sometimes good guys can't win, as much as I hate to admit it. Okay, fine. So this macro level change is an unrealistic outcome. Well, you can always buy someone's freedom then, right? Why didn't they do that? Well, yeah, sure, you can do that. Pool your savings together and you barely have enough to save one slave. So then the next day, a new shipment of slaves come along from other villages. They come pouring in. And then you're like, oh, now we're back to square one. We spent all our money on this one slave and now we have, I don't know, a gazillion more. Purchasing freedom, very noble, very just, but also not a very sustainable or viable plan. Which leaves us at this crossroads. What should first century Christians do then? Rage against the machine doesn't work. Buying your way out of slavery doesn't work. Or not in the long term. What did the first century Christians do? Well, I think what they did was what I like to call a tactical retreat, where they basically go along with the arrangement that the government set up, but we, as Christians, first century Christians, will do it on our own terms. So we're going to uphold earthly authority, but we're going to do it on our own terms by upholding these Christian principles, which 1 Peter 2 verse 16 describes. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. So, how did those first century Christians live up to 1 Peter's instructions? What practical changes can they possibly make to slavery? And at the same time, not disrespect the government, help and save people. So number one, the first thing they did was they introduced the concept of manual labor as a legitimate job description for slaves. Christian slave owners put their foot down and made it clear that, yo, when I buy you, you are by no means a sex toy to me. That is not what you're being bought for. And that is very significant because this is kind of the first appearance of the employer-employee kind of paradigm, where you are a dignified general laborer. You are going to be entitled to compensation for your services rendered. We are a people of equal worth. Therefore, you'll be treated with respect. So from this day forward, when I buy you, we have boundaries, we have structure, we have order. And that was just unheard of at that time. Like, damn, son, you bought him. You can do whatever you want. He's yours. But these Christians said, no sex toys. They will be given actual job descriptions within my household or on my farmland or whatever. Very professional, very dignified approach to people. Second thing they did was Christians at that time encouraged slaves and free people to get married and start families. Very clever, because when you start families and you have like a Christian upbringing, Christian values, then you begin to outgrow or become a significant target or population group that kind of rivals the pagans. So when you become a bigger group, you get a stronger or more bigger voice when you're demanding political leverage or you just want societal change. Simple things, very little kind and just actions like introducing manual labor and just getting people to start getting married, start families, these first century Christians inadvertently, gently, and slowly wore down, chipped away at this cruel institution known as slavery. That's why there's reason behind saying that Christianity at that time was very quietly trying to turn something evil and reprehensible as slavery into something positive. And as a result of their integrity, these Christian slave owners just kept committing to not oppressing the slaves that they bought. Over time and gradually, slavery in the Greco-Roman world started to become an accepted legal status. And it had contractual terms and agreements that included basic human rights and terms and conditions. And I think the best way to describe this kind of drawn out process during the first century is to look up the Greek word used to describe the servant/slave, which is doulos. The proper definition is bondservant, which means it's more than just you're a free individual servicing another person. A bondservant means more than just a person being owned by another person. It became this kind of legal status where people who are in debt would sell themselves into slavery or sell themselves into doulos status because the employee benefits within those contractual conditions were so fair and advantageous to them, and that they could work for their master, quote-unquote master, get benefits, get very ethical treatment and working conditions, and do this while paying off their debts. So it's similar to how, we would commit ourselves to like a phone contract or sign on when you get a new job, get salary, you sign a contract, or leases or loans, or like taking out a mortgage or whatever. Same kind of idea, just seeing the transition from defenseless, helpless, powerless sex slaves morph over a gradual time to accepted legal status. It's kind of fascinating how that happened. Didn't I say this session was going to be one big damage control PR spin? But for those skeptics out there, my works cited are available upon request. But my hope is that you loyal listeners out there understand that Christian belief and practice and philosophical teachings was just the complete opposite of Greco-Roman life. I think it's really cliche to say like, oh, Christianity is so life-giving and it is the way. But it's true, because if you look at it from a historical perspective, it's truly unique and distinct and in a category of its own. It preached that an individual had value, you were good, you didn't exist to serve the government. And it kind of blew people's minds when it said an absolute higher being existed for your benefit, and it was free, no strings attached. You didn't need to like cook up potions and spells and chant stuff to control a god to be on your side. So I hope you found the work of God carried out by first century Christians encouraging and inspiring, and I just hope that we can somehow find a way in the present day to carry on that legacy of I can say a very innovative spirit to influence and impact people around us for the better. Okay, that's it from me. Good job hanging in there and letting all that information sink in. So, thanks for listening, and goodbye.